All right. Well, good evening, everyone. I hope that everyone's having a wonderful day and looking forward to learning something from Miss Shirley Jones. She is going to she's going to facilitate our lesson in leadership tonight on effective communication skills for leadership. And with that, I will let her take it away.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you all for inviting me to join you. It's always a pleasure to facilitate learning opportunities for Blacks in government. Let me just start by sharing how I actually started creating and facilitating sessions for Blacks in government because I was actually drawn to the organization because of our youth oratorical program. And I got involved with that at my agency, the Government Accountability Office, and pretty quickly started sharing the efforts and emceeing the program. I'm not sure how all of the chapters conduct their oratorical contests, but at GAO, we actually do our program before a live audience of GAO employees in the auditorium, usually with about, let's say, 200, 250 people in attendance, including employees, family members, and teachers from the schools. And I remember the first time that I emceed the program afterwards, there were quite a few people, including big members, coming up saying, "Wow, you speak so well." And that was the consistent comment, which was a little bit odd to me because I kept thinking, why would you allow me to facilitate your oratorical contest if you did not believe that I was a good speaker? And so it just struck me that I received so many comments about my speaking abilities, and ultimately it made me believe that maybe some of the people that were complimenting me felt that they did not similarly have the same speaking abilities. And so shortly thereafter, in the years thereafter, I joined GAO's adjunct faculty and started teaching leadership training at the agency and decided I would similarly create and facilitate some sessions specifically for Blacks in government. And actually, the very first session that I created was this one, entitled Effective Communication Skills for Leaders. My first thinking about the topic was that I'm not just a good speaker because I'm a lawyer. I believe I'm a good speaker because I put effort into my communications. And I also came to believe very firmly that it's definitely not just the legal profession where you need strong communication skills. In fact, I don't think there's a profession out there where you don't need strong communication skills. Usually, when I teach this session for Big at the NTI will challenge the audience to try to think of a profession where you wouldn't. So keep that in the back of your mind. If you think that you can come up with a session, a profession that does not require strong communication skills, then let me know what you think. But I simply don't think there's one out there. But even beyond wanting to be successful on our jobs, I think ultimately it boils down to wanting to be effective leaders. And I think every effective leader has to have strong communication skills. And so, therefore, the title, Effective Communication Skills for Leaders, instead of Effective Communication Skills for Employees, because we're more than just employees. So, in light of the time, I want to go ahead, if you all don't mind, and just jump into the tips. Of course, you all have the handout. I want to make sure you all had that in advance because I do think it's easier to follow along. Sometimes when I teach the session, if when we run out of handouts, I see people jotting down notes, and I much rather people not jot down notes, but be able to focus on the conversation. So let's start with tip number one. I firmly believe that this is the ideal starting point for anyone who wants effective communication skills, and that's to practice effective listening. You want to be an effective leader with strong communication skills, you have to first practice effective listening. And that means first becoming an outstanding audience for those who you're talking to. And of course, when I say being an effective listener, I mean more than just hearing what the person is saying. All of us, unless you have a hearing disability, have the ability to hear. But are you actually listening? And I have a great example of that from actually just a few weeks ago. I was down in Atlanta at the Region 4 Regional Training Conference. And the night before the session, I'd already checked into the hotel and I called downstairs to find out what time room service ended. And when the gentleman answered, I specifically said just one sentence: what time does room service end? His answer was yes. Now, obviously, yes is not the appropriate response, but he simply didn't listen. I believe what he heard was, are you all still serving or providing room service? And that's why he said yes. That's the only thing yes really makes sense to. But what I asked him was, what time does room service end? Because I hadn't quite settled in yet and I wanted to know how much time I had left. So I simply repeated the question to him and he responded to it with the actual time. But it was a great example of someone who thought they heard what I said, but they actually weren't listening. Now, there are some easy signs of when someone's not listening to you. And all of these things are things that I've been guilty of. And so when I come up with these tips and criteria, these are things that I've had to personally work on. So for example, if you tend to fidget when someone else is talking, that's a sign that you're not really listening. It's a sign that you really don't want to be there, likely. Do you wait for the speaker to finish his or her point before you make a mental judgment about what they've said? And a lot of us are guilty of that, and that's in part natural because our ability to comprehend is a little quicker than the ability to speak. And so often when someone else is speaking, that's why our mind just kind of flitters around a little bit because we tend to think faster than the average person can talk. So it's natural and it's something that you have to work on. And then the last thing, do you find yourself rehearsing what you're going to say next while the person is speaking? If you're doing any of those things, the likelihood is you're going to miss some of what they're saying. And what's the downside of that? The biggest downside of that is you miss some of what they're saying. And sometimes, especially if you think you're in a disagreement with them, you may find that had you listened to exactly what they said, that you're actually closer rather than farther apart in your perspectives. You may also find if you're not listening fully and your mind is wandering that you missed half of what they said. When I was a new attorney, I had an attorney as a supervisor who was very, very long-winded. And I know you're thinking, what attorneys aren't long-winded? But she was extra long-winded. And one day she's talking to me about an assignment, and I'm standing there looking at her. But actually now my mind is thinking about what I'm going to wear to work tomorrow, where I'm going to work, where I'm going out that night. And then at the end of what she said, when she's wrapping up, she said, okay, so you got that right? You understand the assignment? And now I'm thinking, oh, wow, I missed half of what she said. And of course, as a new attorney, you're not going to acknowledge that, hey, I stopped listening. You're not going to do that. And so I had to pretty quickly just try to piece together what I had heard and try to summarize it back for her. And fortunately, it was exactly what I needed, but I didn't ever want to risk that again. I did not want to risk. And so I had to come up with some strategies for effective listening. And I'll share a few of those with you here so that we can quickly move on to the next point. If you're in a meeting, I would say the best strategy possible is to choose a good place to sit. I find even when I'm teaching at the big conference and facilitating at other organizations, people come in and they go right to the back of the room. That's the best place to not pay attention. If you really want to pay attention, the best place is in the front of the room. One, you're going to be in the best spot to hear, but it's not likely that you will become so relaxed in the front of the room that you either fall asleep or start fidgeting and doing other things. The second strategy is to actually give the speaker your full attention and force yourself not to start rehearsing your response. Sometimes you just simply have to tell yourself you're going to listen to what they have to say and just focus on it. And I find sometimes we lack that focus because we are focusing on the person rather than the content, especially if you already have some type of uh, previous relationship or contact with that person, whether it be negative or positive. You almost think that you know them and you know where they're going with it. And so I always encourage people to focus on the content of the communication and not the person. I also encourage you to participate without interrupting. And we all know the people who can't stand for a few seconds without interrupting almost every sentence that you're making. But I encourage people not to do that because you're not only making that person feel unappreciated by interrupting them, you're also missing what they're trying to say to you. And then the last tip is to just simply stop rehearsing what you're going to say while the person is speaking. I remember one of the first times I taught this session at the National Training Institute, one of the attorneys on my actual staff at GAO was there. And she raised her hand and she said that the reason why she rehearses what she's going to say is simply because she wants to sound intelligent and she wants to make sure that what she's saying is on point. And I share with her that in order for your communications to be effective, they don't have to be perfect. You don't have to have a rehearsed speech. In my opinion, and of course I knew her, if you have the subject matter knowledge, then you have something of value to share. It doesn't have to be so perfectly worded that it sounds like a speech. Now, Christian has been around me quite a few times, and I'm sure I would think she's noticed that when I do remarks at any of the meetings, I rarely use any notes. And that's simply because I don't believe it has to be perfect. I believe that I convey information fairly well at these meetings without those notes because I believe I know what I'm talking about. So you really don't have to rehearse what you're going to say while the person is speaking and thereby miss half of what they're saying. So those are my tips on practicing effective listening, which I think is the most important thing to becoming a more effective communicator.
Shirley,
So,
could I ask you a question about that last point that you made?
sure.
When you said it, it made sense because there's someone in particular that I'm thinking of to where when she talks, it sounds like it's rehearsed, but I think it's because she doesn't have the subject matter expertise. So there's only a limited amount of things that she can say in order to add value to the conversation. So
Absolutely.
you find
Now,
that's a lot that what happens in
right.
networking environments and that sort of thing.
Absolutely. Now, I'm a big fan of sticking to what you know.
Mm-hmm.
And because people will know, just as you have concluded
Mm-hmm.
that she's not a subject matter expert and that she's speaking on things that she really doesn't know that much about, it comes across.
Yeah.
So if you don't know, then don't say it. Or start out by sharing that your knowledge or expertise is limited.
Right.
I'm just not a big fan of, I just don't believe everything has to be perfect. And I also don't believe that we have to pretend to be something that we aren't. I actually think that takes away from being an effective leader when people believe you're almost being fraudulent in your abilities.
I have a question as well. You mentioned at the beginning of your talk that you prefer that people listen rather than taking notes. Do you think that taking notes hinders your ability to listen effectively?
Absolutely. And now there are some contexts where you can take notes, but they should be very shorthand. But I definitely find that when people are taking notes, they're not fully listening. They're focusing on making those notes perfect. They're doing that. And some years ago, I used to be on GAO's Employee Advisory Council. And the way that works is representatives from various employee resource organizations, as well as representatives from various employee segments, would come together quarterly and meet with our comptroller general and other leaders. And I remember in one particular meeting, one of the leaders in the room was basically talking about one of the ways GAO could save money, because of course we're talking about the budget, was to continue to downsize our administrative professionals. Now, mind you, we had an administrative professionals rep in the room. We had 3 of them in the room. None of them said anything. And I'm looking around the room and I'm watching them write down notes, and I'm thinking, are they really not going to address that? They're really not going to say anything when this guy is basically saying, we're going to cut you and your constituencies to save money. And so when we had a break, I went up to them and I said, I was really waiting on one of you all to confront that issue. And one of them said to me, oh, I didn't hear him say it. I was taking notes. And I'm thinking, and you know what I said to her? You're not the note taker. We have a note taker here. We're going to have minutes. You all really need to be listening in real time. And I really think, especially when you're in a situation where there's no exam, like for this, there's no exam at the end. So you don't have to be jotting down everything I'm saying because you won't be tested on it. I think in sessions like these, and when you take leadership training classes at the NTI or any other session, you have to listen to get every kernel of wisdom that could possibly apply to you. And what I find myself doing, because I still take classes from other people, I'm listening, and when they say something that I need, I jot that down, just that one thing, and then I go back to listening. I've attended the AFIA conference for the last couple of years, and I sit in those rooms and I just write down quotes. I write down the quote and then I go back to listening. I just don't take copious notes. Any other questions before I move on to the second one?
Real quick, what is AFIA?
Oh, I'm sorry, the African American Federal Executives Association. I have become the kind of government worker that I hated when I first came into the government. And because when I first got there, I was like, okay, could they stop using all of these acronyms that I don't know anything about? But I see I have slipped into that same kind of a habit. So let's
It
move on.
happens to the best of us.
That's right. That's right. So let's move on to number 2. The next tip is encouraging others to listen to you without asking. The important part is the without asking part. So how do you do that? First, if you've been an outstanding audience for them, they are likely to be an outstanding audience for you. I find that most of us reciprocate. So if we believe that someone listens to us, we will more likely in turn listen to them. So that's the first step. So if you've mastered tip number 1, practicing effective listening, then you have a leg up on getting people to listen to you without asking. But there's some other tips as well. I would suggest that you should use positive communication. If you really want someone to tune out from you, become negative. Great example, we have one of our regional representatives that comes out to the Region 11 Council meeting. She is usually very negative in her packaging of her points. Sometimes she makes wonderful points, but I assure you 90% of the people in the room aren't listening to her. I have made myself listen to her no matter what she says, but I know there's so many people that aren't listening to her because her communications always turn negative. So if you really want people to listen to you, keep the communications positive. I would also say that if you really want people to listen to you, keep it simple. No one wants to listen to people that are constantly giving soliloquies and long speeches every time you're talking to them. So I try to keep my communications very simple. At the council meetings that I chair every month, if someone raises a question or a point, I respond to it, but I try to keep it very short and to the point. Now, of course, there's some downsides to that. Sometimes people think you're being a little too brief with them, a little bit too terse. But I think there's a balancing to it. Sometimes, yes, you do have to be a little bit more long-winded than perhaps I would like. But I definitely think if you want people to listen, the shorter and simpler the communication and the clearer. Don't be ambiguous about what you want or what you're asking for if you want people to listen to you. And then the last 2 points on that I think are really important. If you want people to listen to you, ask them for their input. No one wants to be involved in a one-sided conversation. So if you're actually talking and asking for input, they will actually listen. One, they'll listen because they feel appreciated and they feel valued because you're asking them for their input. But let's go back to the example that I gave from the supervisor that I wasn't listening to, and then she got to the end of her instructions and I wondered if I had captured them well. It taught me a valuable lesson to listen. So if you know someone's going to ask you for their input or ask you in the end, so do you understand what I'm saying, and expect for you to regurgitate some of it back, you'll listen. But I think ultimately you shouldn't be asking for input to test someone. You should be asking them for input because you actually value what they're saying and you believe that you can learn something from them. So those are my strategies for encouraging others to listen to you without asking, because anyone can pound their fist on the desk and say, are you listening to me? But you want the people that you work with, whether it be in Blacks in Government or in the workplace or in other community activities, you want them to listen to you because they value what you're saying and believe that you in turn value what they're saying. So any questions about that second bullet point, encouraging others to listen to you without asking?
Well, when you gave your example about the person at the regional meetings that, always has presented in a negative manner,
right,
what are your tips for handling that? Because, in my role as chapter president, someone may not say anything to me about something until a chapter meeting, then they kind of want to challenge me in front of folks. I try to, keep my face calm, but I'm really getting heated on the inside. But what are tips you can have for, handling those type of situations? Because I still need to be an effective listener,
Absolutely.
but my mental is going crazy because I'm trying not to get upset or irritated.
Absolutely. I do 2 things. The first thing I would do, because it sounds like this is a person who does it regularly, is that right?
Mm-hmm.
I would have a conversation with that person outside of the meeting.
Mm-hmm.
And even if it's just a day or 2 before the next meeting, I would send them an email or pick up the phone and call them and ask them if they had any concerns about the agenda or any other action items moving forward that perhaps you could address outside of the meeting. Mm-hmm. And I would share with them that the conversation is not because you don't want to be transparent at the meeting, but because you value everyone's time and you want to make sure that if you can address some issues outside of the meeting that you do that. And so that's one tip to talk about, because hopefully that person, if you do that, that person should feel embarrassed to in turn do it again at the next meeting. And if they do actually do the exact same thing, then I believe that gives you room at that meeting to say, well, as we discussed yesterday, and just let the audience know that you have been trying to address this person's needs both outside and inside the meeting. Because if this is a person, if their goal is to be disruptive, you still have to give them room as a member, but you also have to address it in a manner where the rest of the body is on board with you, not on board with that person.
Right. Okay.
Now, of course, in the meeting itself, I mean, you've seen how I try to handle it in our meetings, and I try to keep just a straight face. I not to cut the person off. Try really hard not to, unless they get too long-winded. I try to actually let them finish what they say, and then I give a very short answer and then move on.
Yeah.
But I think the best tip for you would be to have a conversation with the person beforehand. And I mean, you and I have been around each other enough for me to know that you're not a confrontational person, and so I do know that you can have that conversation with the person in a manner in which they actually believe that you're valuing their input.
Okay.
So that would be my suggestion.
Okay, thanks.
So,
Any other?
I had a question on that. Your point says keep it positive and keep it simple. Um, One thing, how do you go about delivering negative news, for lack of a better term, in a positive manner? Like, what if the content of what you're saying is in and of itself negative?
Right. Well, one of the first things I learned in some of the leadership classes that I took, especially from a managerial perspective, is that you start by saying something positive. There's always something positive to say. And sometimes I'll start by saying, that's an interesting point, or that's a good point.
You do
Because
good.
absolutely. See, there are certain things that if someone's around me a lot,
Yeah.
they'll see, because I rarely in any context tell someone they're wrong. You almost have to push me into saying you're wrong. I'm going to try to give some validity to what you said and then clarify it. Rather than tell you you're wrong, I rather clarify it. I'll start by saying that's a good point or that's an interesting point, and then I will give what I believe is the correct answer or the feedback. So it depends on, and for your question, Herschel, if it's you're giving someone some negative feedback or negative news, you can still start with something positive. There's something that happened or transpired at some point that will allow you to say something positive. Yeah, I'm a big believer that you can learn something from everyone. Does that answer your question, Herschel?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, very good. So let's move on to number 3. Know what you communicate through your body language. And a lot of people don't pay attention to the body language that they're conveying. And I try to, in the meetings in front of the council, I try to not allow anybody to read my thoughts on anything. Now, every once in a while, I do things intentionally because depending on what it is, I do want people to know what I think without having to say it. So there are times when you use body language to your advantage to show people something, but there are times when there at all times you should be watching your body language. Whenever I'm doing presentation, actually, I mean, it's difficult in this context, but if I'm doing a presentation in a room full of people, I'm watching everybody's body language for one really important reason. I want to make sure I'm not boring anybody. So I'm looking around, seeing if I have the audience, the attendees with me, and I can tell that by body language. And I'm not saying every once in a while, sure. Even I have done a presentation where I see someone nodding. I'm far too positive of a thinker to believe that's because I'm boring them. I'm more likely to think, oh, they had a rough night last night, they're tired. Now, of course, if 20 out of 22 were falling asleep, then that tells me I am boring them. But you watch people's body language, but not to the extent where you think every little thing means something negative. And I've actually taken body language classes, and there's some body language experts that would say if someone has their arms crossed across their chest, it means they're closed off and they're not listening. But I think if you attend a lot of meetings like I do, and especially when people are sitting down, a lot of women do that because they're cold. They do it because it's just simply comfortable to them. And then even people who sit with their kind of, head in their hand, some body language experts would say that that's a sign of boredom. Everything depends on the context. I watch the body language, but you have to be doing something a little more than one thing for me to conclude something negative. But there are plenty of people who are just the opposite. They'll take one sign of a particular body language to say that you're either disagreeing with them. For instance, one of the things that I've constantly been, I wouldn't say accused of, but pointed out to me is that I rarely smile. People think that smiling is a sign that you're with them and that you're on board with what they're saying. And so I try to, even in the council meeting, sometimes it'll just pop in my mind and it'll just say, Shirley, smile. Let them see you smiling sometimes. And so I'm constantly considering my own body language, what my body language is conveying to the audience, and I'm also watching everybody else's body language to see what it's saying to me. I mean, some things are obvious. Like if someone's rolling their eyes, I don't think you could ever take anything positive from an eye roll. Or another example would be someone who never looks you in the eye. I've heard in your eyes when you're talking to them. Usually that's a sign of some level of discomfort if you're talking to someone and they never look at you. I mean, obviously you don't want the opposite either, to constantly stare at people when they're talking to you. So the tip there is to know what you communicate through your body language, and to try to send effective body language cues. The first one would be to, as Judge Judy says, to pay attention when you're smiling. Are you smiling at the appropriate time, or as she says, is it an inappropriate affect? There was a young lady at GAO. We would be in meetings and she would always be smiling and sometimes even giggling, and I would think, wow, that's as Judge Judy said, an inappropriate affect, because it made you wonder, is she thinking about something in her head that's totally unrelated to what we're doing, or is she uncomfortable? Because sometimes people will smile or giggle when they're uncomfortable. I've seen people chair meetings and smile or giggle because they're uncomfortable chairing the meeting. So that's definitely something to watch. And then make eye contact, watch your posture. I mean, obviously, we see people slump down in a chair in a meeting. That's going to make you think that they're not paying attention and not interested. So those are my thoughts on knowing what you communicate through your body language. Any comments or questions on that?
How would you suggest being more aware of that? I know my personal issue with communication, I think I'm relatively good at it, but one thing that I do struggle with is my body language and my facial expressions, especially when I hear something that I'm not too keen on,
Right,
or that I think is stupid or whatever, what have you. I'm not very good at, I have a terrible poker face.
right.
So how would you suggest that um, myself and others who have that issue kind of take control of that?
I think it's simply certain things just have to be practiced. I don't think there are necessarily any tips that I can give you beyond telling you, if you know that's an issue for you, you have to decide you're going to work on it. I had a great example or a great experience that made me really want to be better at it. And I had gone to an evening church service, and there was a out of town guest speaker, and he's a traveling evangelist, and he was giving a a sermon at a youth retreat, and he's at a really conservative church, but he just really went out in left field talking about young people having sex, and I'm sitting there thinking, if you're making me uncomfortable and I'm really not that conservative, I know how you're making the rest of these people feel in this room. And I looked up on the what do you call it? Not, I don't want to call it a stage, but where all the ministers sit. I always forget the name of what that area
The
is called.
pulpit.
Yeah, in the pulpit area. And I feel very embarrassed that I couldn't come up with pulpit. But the pulpit
It's
area,
been a long day, Shirley.
it's been a long day. But there were about 8 ministers up there. And I just went down the row, and I'm looking at them, and I'm looking at the first one, and I'm thinking, oh, he's having a problem with it. And then I could tell which ones had a problem with it and which one was trying to support him. And then I got to one of the assistant pastors from my own church, and I looked at him, and I could tell you he had a blank stare. You could not tell what he thought about anything. And I thought, wow, that's how I want to be. I want to be able to sit on a stage or in a room and no one know what I think unless you want them to. And so I just simply started to practice it. When I would go to meetings, I would just think about having a poker face and just, I want people to believe I'm listening, but at the same time, I don't want them to know what position I would take on the topic unless I open my mouth and tell them that. And so I think it simply boils down to just practicing it. Just practicing, as you said, having a poker face. Because you really do. There are definitely times outside of playing poker where you just simply don't want people to be able to read you.
Mm-hmm.
So practice it, Herschel. Any other questions before I move on to the next one?
April, don't let us dominate the questions. If you have anything, feel free to speak up.
Okay. Well, I did have a question in terms of I didn't know if she was going to get to it later or not, but do you recommend any type of, like Toastmasters or anything like that? Um, and I also wanted to
Absolutely.
ask, do you,
I absolutely believe in Toastmasters. And I wrote my weekly remarks maybe about 3 or 4 weeks ago about people who use ahs and ums so much that it's distracting. And one of my pieces of advice was to join Toastmasters. I believe there's a lot of value in it. They One of the things that I find most valuable, and I'm not an active member now, but one of the things I found most valuable with Toastmasters is the impromptu speeches that they encourage attendees to do. And I think it not only allows them to help you with the ahs and ums, because one of the things they do with it is when you do that impromptu speech, you go up and you pull a topic out of a basket and you give an impromptu speech on it, and they count the ahs and the ums. So that's one value, because it will allow them to assist you in knowing whether or not that's a real habit. But I believe the bigger value in Toastmasters is the more you get up and do either the impromptu speeches or the scheduled speeches, the more comfortable you will be talking in front of an audience. Does that answer your question, April?
yes, I'm sorry, my line was muted, but yes, it did.
Okay, very good. Okay, so let's move on to point number 4, and I'm going to go through that one pretty quickly because it's related to point number 3, and it's simply to watch the body language of the listener for what they may be conveying to you. I definitely think it would be a mistake to watch your own body language but not simultaneously also be watching the body language of those that you're talking to, because they could be sending you very important clues as well. I pointed out that when I do presentations, I'm always panning the audience to watch to see if the audience is with me, because who wants to be boring? Who wants that? So clearly, if I think I'm losing the audience, I need to do something to bring them back in and to regain their interest. And the best way to do that is obviously to pay attention to those around you. But that's in a larger setting. Even in the smaller settings, you want to pay attention to them, even if you're talking to someone one-on-one. Yeah, and let's take the supervisor, for instance. If you have a supervisor who does not have a poker face and you're talking to them and they're frowning or otherwise doing things that let you know either they are not understanding what you're saying or are disagreeing with what you're saying, you can ask for their input. So, and if you all are paying attention, I loop everything together. Everything is connected for me. All of these skills and tips are things that you do in conjunction with one another, not in isolation. So, as I noted, if you're watching the listener's body language and they seem to not be on board with what you're saying, and you don't necessarily know, if someone's frowning, you don't know if they're frowning because they disagree with you. You don't know if they're frowning because they don't understand what you're saying. So the way to clear that up would be to ask them for their input. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about asking for input in a few minutes. But suffice it to say here that I think it is just very valuable to be paying attention to what the person you're talking to is not only saying with their mouth, but what they're saying with their body language. So it works both ways, watching what cues you're sending to them in conversation through body language and watching what cues they're sending to you through body language. So let's move on to number 5, building rapport and support through positive communications to store up goodwill, because I definitely think this is an important tip as well, because ultimately leaders also build relationships. That's a strong sign of leadership, and it also impacts your ability to be even more effective. None of us are little islands unto ourselves, and so if we are to be effective, we have to have the right people around us. And I think all of us that are leaders in Blacks in Government, in our various committees and other positions, we know that we can't be a one-man show. And so if you're going to be an effective leader, then you have to store up that goodwill, and you do that through positive communications. Even with people that I've had negative interactions with, I try to go to them periodically and have positive communications with them, because I'm trying to store up goodwill and build a rapport with them, so that when the time comes later, then perhaps they're not as disruptive in a meeting, or perhaps when you present an idea at a meeting, they're more likely to be on board with it. So let's talk about a few strategies for building rapport, even with people that you had negative interactions with in the past. One of the tips that I like to share is starting all of your communications in a friendly manner with light pleasantries. It tends to set the tone for a friendly dialogue. I pointed out earlier, in conjunction with my response to Herschel about tips for delivering not so positive information, start out with some light pleasantries just to set the tone. Because sometimes even when you have to deliver negative information, it does not mean that you feel negative towards the person. Every year I have to have feedback sessions with the attorneys that I supervise, and they're not always wonderful conversations to have, but because I've had positive communications with them throughout the year, and because I can also point out something of value that they've done throughout the year, then I can start that communication in a positive manner. And so it sets the tone such that the overall conversation does not have to become negative. If you also want to build rapport, then we have to support the interests of other people. And that's an important point, whether it's team building at work or team building in Blacks in Government. I definitely find in the Blacks in Government context, often sometimes as leaders, we're so intent on getting what we want done that we don't support the interests of others and actually give them room to be leaders in their own capacity. Because I definitely think we're all leaders regardless of the title. And then another strategy for building rapport is to always be open and direct, and to be conscious of how we speak to people at all times. So we just have to be cognizant. We have to be cognizant of how we talk. Just kind of going back to that exam, and I use this example a lot because it's one of my own challenges, one of my own tests, and that is the certain individuals that are always negative at the council meetings. I have to be conscious of how I talk to them. It's not acceptable for me to say, well, they talk to me a certain way, and so I'm going to give it back to them. That's human nature. Human nature says that. But an effective leader has to always be conscious of how they speak to other people, not just because of the impact on that other person, but because of the impact on everyone else that's listening. Quite often I'll have members come up to me after a council meeting and tell me that they really respected how I handled a particular situation. That wouldn't happen if every time someone said something negative to me, if I blew up about it or otherwise just felt like I was giving back to them what they gave to me. And so I think one of the biggest strategies is simply always being conscious of how you speak to people, regardless of how they speak to you. So any questions or comments on that, building rapport and support through positive communications? All right, let's move on to number 6, balancing advocacy of your ideas by inquiring about the views and concerns of others. And that's where I like to talk about actually getting input from those that you are trying to influence. And I mean, because ultimately it boils down to wanting to influence the opinions of others. And one of the best ways to do that is, rather than always forging ahead and pushing forward your agenda, sometimes we have to pause and ask for input. Some of the strategies for that is, the first step is knowing that you don't have all the answers. You may have some wonderful ideas on how to improve the workplace. You may have some wonderful ideas for any effort that you have within Blacks in government, but the bottom line is we have to know that we don't have all the answers. And when we don't recognize that, it actually hinders our ability to get better information. The second strategy is believing that you can learn something from everybody. When you believe that, it actually promotes discussion. Even the person who's the most negative person in the room can often share something of value, because ultimately, often they're subject matter experts as well. They simply don't know how to package that expertise in a manner that makes people want to listen to them. And then the third point, which I think is kind of counterintuitive to most of us, we have to actually search for evidence that proves us wrong. We don't want to be wrong, but you have to search for evidence, because ultimately, for me personally, I'd rather be wrong at the outset of a project than at the end of a project, because that way you don't waste a lot of time. And so that's why I listen to people whenever they're sharing input, because I may very well be wrong, because I don't know everything. I don't. I definitely recognize that. And so I search for that evidence by listening, by simply listening to those that are around me. And then the last point that I would make there is, when you're asking for input, you really should be sincere about it. So you should inquire rather than interrogate. Often, I find that people will ask you for your input, but you can tell by the tone of their voice they really don't want it. You can tell by their body language they really don't want it. If someone says, "What now?" that's actually inquiring. That's actually asking for input. But they're asking in such a negative manner that who wants to share anything with someone who is actually letting them know, I don't really value what you're saying. I'm just listening because I have to. And so that way everybody's guard is up. So I encourage you, yes, to ask for input, but to also deliver the request for their opinion in a manner in which they actually believe that you're sincere. Any questions on number 6, balancing advocacy of your ideas with inquiry? Because sometimes that's a difficult one, because sometimes we go into these positions, whether it be at work or in our advocacy organizations, with a lot of great ideas. And we know that time is of the essence. But I assure you, there's always time to ask someone what they think. And I'm not saying give them a month to review your thoughts, but give them, right then and there, if you're talking to them in person or if it's by email, give them a day or so and then you move forward. But it will be beneficial to everybody involved if you actually do that. Okay, let's move on to number 7, organizing your thoughts for maximum effectiveness. Think before you speak. Now, sometimes people can read that as inconsistent with what I said at the beginning. Don't rehearse what you're going to say before you're saying it. Those are two different things. When I say rehearse, sometimes people, and obviously I've been guilty of it before too, you're so determined that you want to make your point very succinctly. I found myself in this position in delegates assembly because you only have 2 minutes. When you go to that mic, you have 2 minutes, so it has to be very concise. So yes, you're going to rehearse what you're saying in that context. So there are exceptions to every rule. And this is one of those times where you need to think before you speak. I mean, outside of delegates assembly, there's rarely anyone timing us. So we have time to actually think about what we're going to say. And the reason why that is so important is because it keeps your audience with you. If you thought about what you've said before you say it, it's not likely you're going to ramble. You know, I've been at plenty of meetings in the workplace and in Blacks in Government where a person gets up and they're on the agenda and they ramble. And the first thing I think is you didn't prepare. You didn't, because I'm not sure how anyone could prepare and then ramble. Now, well, I take that back. There is a possibility. Nerves could make someone do that. But I'm also a firm believer that the more prepared you are, that preparation will overcome the nerves. You may still be nervous. I mean, almost every time I speak in a formal context, I'm nervous for the first paragraph. The first paragraph that comes out of my mouth, I am nervous. But from there, it subsides because now I've gotten my introduction out of the way and I have relaxed because I know I have told the audience what I'm going to talk about, and from there, it doesn't matter how perfect it is. No one knows what I wrote in that paper. They just know what they hear coming out of my mouth. So it doesn't matter if things are out of order, so to speak. So organize your thoughts for maximum effectiveness. And the best way to do that, of course, is to just spend time thinking about it. You know, often even when I'm doing an impromptu, well, rarely are we doing anything impromptu. Impromptu to me is someone just on the spot asking you a thought and you have to jump up right then and there. And most of the time in my work and in what I do in Blacks in Government, I have at least the duration of when the person is talking. And so sometimes even at the council meeting, while someone is talking, I just jot down a couple of points, and usually I'm not writing them out in sentences because that's when you're going to lose half of what they're saying. I'm writing down my outline of what I want to say, like a word for one point, a word for the next point, and I might look down at those words to jog my memory before I start speaking. And so that's what I mean by being prepared and actually organizing your thoughts, because that way you can keep it positive, you can keep it simple because you've thought about it beforehand.
Shirley, can I jump in?
Sure, absolutely.
I know we're not quite through your list, but it is 8 o'clock, and I know there's a hard stop for a couple.
Okay.
So how would you like to go about the rest of your presentation? Because you're on point 7, or 8, 9, and 10. How would you like to go about that? Because Herschel will have to release the connection since he's hosting it.
Okay. Well, what I would suggest, I mean, I do think, I'm hoping that I am just as good of a writer as I am a speaker. And I do believe that the last 3 points are somewhat self-explanatory, embracing the use of email and using those to actually encompass some of the same earlier points I made, being focused on your audience and projecting a positive image. I do think the last 3 are probably more self-explanatory than the others were. And so I would suggest either we can conclude it here with the points I've already made, and of course with everyone having the handout in hand, and I'd be happy anytime in the future to come back. But I'm satisfied if you all are satisfied that we have sufficiently covered the topic. And of course, you could feel free to share my email address. Herschel already has it, but you can share it with April as well. And if she had any follow-up comments or questions on any of the points, we can revisit or conclude anything via email.
Well, we'll definitely be sure to, as I told you before when we were preparing for this, that all of these touch points, these are recorded. So our process is to send out the recording. I'll send that out tomorrow. It'll
Okay.
be on YouTube for everybody to access who wasn't able to get on with us today. And along with that, I'll make sure I send out your contact information, at least your email, so that if anyone has any follow-up questions, they can address them directly to you. I will say this, I do appreciate the things that you've shared. It was definitely enlightening for me, so hopefully I'm not alone in that. And if we have any follow-up, if anything comes to me, I'll make sure I forward it along. And like I said, I'll make sure everyone gets your email address as well.
Okay, very good.
Would you want your Gmail or your GAO email address,
You
Shirley?
know what? Now that I have this new Gmail account, I'm going to use it. So I want to make good use of it. So send out the Gmail account, and I will check it regularly, which
All
is
right.
what I should have been using always anyway.
Before we do sign off, April, did you have any other questions to ask of Ms. Jones? She's still muted. Well, hopefully she did not have any since I can't hear her. But I think that'll wrap up our touch point for today. Again, Shirley, thank you for your time and all of your expertise, and I look forward to utilizing some of these skills and things that you've shared, and also meeting you at the NTI next month or later this month.
Okay, very good. And definitely feel free to invite me back. I enjoy doing these types of sessions, and this was my first doing one on Google Hangout, so it was a great experience.
So you enjoyed it, using this platform, Shirley? Does it work for you?
I did.
Okay, good.
Awesome.
Good. We're hoping to get more folks to use this throughout Big because, everyone can't be in the same location all the time, so.
Absolutely. I think it's a good vehicle.
Yeah, okay, good. Well, thank you, Shirley, as always. So appreciate it.
Okay, great. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, guys.
Sure.
Bye-bye.
Bye.